It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce Simon Winchester to you tonight. He's known to many of us through his prolific writing, but we also, or at least I was delighted to be reminded that he, when he graduated from Oxford University in 1966, he took a degree in geology, because that's what I did. And then he went off and worked in another field after a year, and so did I. But Simon is here tonight to talk about the geology that he's never lost any interest in. He's had 3 of his books, recent books, Krakatoa, the book about William Smith, the father of modern geology, and now tonight, The Crack in the Edge of the World, about the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. So Simon continues to show an interest and to share that interest with all of us in the field of natural geological phenomena. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Simon Winchester.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And also, I should note I'm actually a member of this of the Athenaeum, but this is the only time I've ever been here. So I send in my $200 every year, but never actually the kind of member you really want. Just sends the money. I'm going to talk to you somewhat about the San Francisco event, but first of all, I have to remark on the awful topicality of writing about earthquakes at the moment, something that the publicity department at HarperCollins is well aware of course. It seems that with this book, I write about an earthquake, and there's a terrible earthquake in Kashmir, and the last book was about a tsunami in the Indian Ocean, and there was a terrible tsunami in the Indian Ocean. And so they're saying now in Chateau HarperCollins in New York that whenever Winchester writes a book, stay indoors. And I'm relieved and delighted that you've taken the risk to come out here tonight. So thank you very much indeed. I am going to talk a bit about the San Francisco event, but I want to stress that it was not my intention to write a disaster book or a series of disaster books. After the tsunami, there was a profile in the New York Times of me in which Deborah Solomon, I was obviously very flattered to be profiled, but they called me the Dean of Disaster, as if I had some peculiar interest in catastrophes, and I really don't. And what I want to do is to try and place this event, as I tried to place Krakatoa, in a much wider context, because I think it is a very interesting event for all sorts of more profound reasons than the catastrophe itself. I will, however, begin this talk by describing in some measure what happened, because it was a tremendous calamity, and the details of it, I think, are quite fascinating. San Francisco, I was going to say San Francisco to an Englishman is obviously a very, very young city, but of course to Bostonians it's tremendously young as well. It was founded essentially in 1833 by an Englishman, a man called William Richardson, who lived there on his own for 5 years, doing the monstrously unromantic business of trading in tallow with the local coast Miwok Indians. And I would have thought it would have been a really dismal existence, just living in the fog and the cold, all on your own, dealing in this boring substance of tallow. But anyway, he did it for 5 years until in about 1838 someone came and joined him, so I guess they could then have conversations about tallow. And the place really didn't take off at all, and by the mid-1840s it was still 40 or 50 or 60 people. And it had a name by this time. And there was a Spanish mission a few miles away, and a little encampment of Spanish and then Mexican soldiers. And the whole entity was given the name Yerba Buena, after a mint, a wild mint, which grew on the east side of the peninsula. And there it probably would have remained as just a tiny little encampment and settlement until the event that, of course, all Americans know about only too well, which was in January 1848, the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill near Sacramento, and the beginning of this amazing period in Western history, the gold rush, when people came either via the long sea route round Cape Horn or more treacherously across the Isthmus of Panama and by mule train and then taking a boat up the west coast, or more arduously, most arduously of all, of course, over land. And they arrived in San Francisco as the great sort of staging post before moving on to try their luck in the hills near Sacramento. And San Francisco, as a consequence, grew from this nothing little hamlet into a pretty substantial city very, very quickly. I mean, it had by 1849 50,000 people, by 1855 100,000, by 1860 200,000 people. At the time of the tragedy, it was 400,000 people. People talk of San Francisco as being a city which was never a town. It just translated itself from a village into a big city very, very quickly, and which accounts for the somewhat sort of ramshackle way it was designed and the inconvenient pattern of streets going over the hills and so on and so forth. But what really marked it out, I think, was the character of the people who initially settled there. Not surprisingly, for a mining community, it was nearly all men who came there to do the mining, not accompanied by their families, but joined in fairly short order by legions of women, women of whom I think it can be said they were of somewhat flexible moral standards, or flexibility in all kinds of ways, I imagine. And so the city grew up as a place of, I mean, it was a very dirty city, mud and no duckboards laid down, and the rain, of course, turned the earth into mud, and they burned this very low-grade coal which came from the nearby mines in Mount Diablo and later in Oregon and Washington. And so it was smoky and gritty. But it was principally known as a place for a sort of a non-stop Bacchanalia. It was just especially for the people that actually found gold and came back to spend their money. The institution that I liked most of all was an enormous hotel, 1,000-room hotel, which was called the Hotel Nymphomania. We just imagine what kind of behavior went on there. But I was thrilled to learn when I was in San Francisco a couple of weeks ago that the owner of the Hotel Nymphomania, his descendants remain in the city, sit today on the board of the De Young Museum, which is the really silk stocking, the equivalent of the Met and the Museum of Art here. And is wonderful and very much a San Francisco story that out of sin was born high culture and respectability. And that was the way the city began to change at the end of the 19th century, because it was essentially a matter of official policy that because America was now looking westward across the Pacific Ocean and had a big imperial, colonial possession in the Philippines and doing an enormous amount of business with China, and ever since Admiral Perry had been doing business with Japan, it was thought necessary to have an imperial capital on the west coast, somewhere from which the navy could sail and from which empire could be organized and prosecuted. And the obvious choice was the biggest city, because Seattle, Portland, and Los Angeles were relatively small. But San Francisco was big and bustling and rich. And so on top of this rambunctious, Saturnalian, sort of wicked city, there was a veneer, was sort of welded onto it, if that's not too mixing of a metaphor, of sort of marble and respectability, and big buildings, banks and stock exchanges and federal government offices went up, and skyscrapers, and there were caryatids and columns and pilasters and cornices and cupolas and all the sort of engine work of showy respectability. But there was a sort of weird disconnect about it. It was a bit like sort of constructing the Supreme Court and putting it in Las Vegas. You didn't have to scratch very far below the surface of this apparent respectability to find the old, bawdy city that had grown up as a consequence of the gold rush. Well, this duality was very much reflected by what was going on in the city on the evening before the earthquake, and that was Tuesday, the 17th of April 1906. You had the high and the low represented. Enrico Caruso, was in town that day with the New York Opera performing on this particular night Carmen, but he was there for a season, and all the swells of San Francisco were there. But at the same time, the brothels were heaving, bursting at the seams, and the bars were just going wild. John Barrymore was there. I mean, a marvelous illustration of the kind of thing I'm trying to say. Barrymore was there, but actually not to perform. He was there on his way to Australia, and he had stopped off to pick up chorus girls. He loved sleeping with chorus girls, apparently, and this was a place to find them in abundance. So the city that night, the Tuesday night, so it perhaps wasn't as much of a bacchanal as had it been a Friday or a Saturday night, people left the opera at 10:30, 11 o'clock at night and repaired to the fine restaurants, Delmonico's and places like that. But they quietened down. I think Caruso left the bar he went to at about 1:30 in the morning, and there was a roller derby, and there was an ice rink which was terribly busy. And most of the patrons of most of the bars were thrown out by about 2 o'clock. And by about 2:30, the city essentially quietened down. And the fire chief, Dennis Sullivan, was a bit irritated because that night there were 3 fires. San Francisco, because of all the redwood and the pine, the very resinous pine that they built the houses out of, burned very, very severely, very frequently. And Sullivan was irritated when he went to bed at about 3, having put out the 3rd fire that night. And as he crawled into bed beside his wife, they slept on the 3rd floor of a fire station on Bush Street. He remarked to her that it was annoying him and worrying him that the wind was setting from the west and it was quite fresh. And a westerly wind to a firefighter in those days in San Francisco was a bad wind because it would spread conflagrations in a particularly inconvenient way. Anyway, just to sort of give a further impression of what it was like that night, I'll just read you a tiny bit from the book. I'm going to read you 2 bits, but one here. It said that some of those who walked home late or rose unusually early noticed that a number of animals in the city behaved a little oddly that night. The horses in a livery stable on Powell Street, for example, seemed skittish, and in fire stations men could be heard behind the stable doors soothing animals that appeared unduly restless. One of the better-known first-person accounts of the earthquake was in the June 1906 issue of Everybody's magazine by the young Paris-born American writer named James Marie Hopper. He wrote of passing a livery stable on Post Street and of hearing the obviously unhappy horses inside. He asked the stable boy idling at the entrance about it. "Restless tonight," the youngster is said to have replied. "Don't know why." The sun was due to come up that Wednesday at 5:31 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. The sky had begun to lighten about 15 minutes before 5, and by the time the bells of Old St. Mary's Church in Chinatown had pealed the hour, all of the sky beyond the hills of Oakland and Livermore was lightening fast, limned with the palest, clearest eggshell blue. The gas lights that had illuminated the deserted streets dimmed and were snuffed out with faint popping sounds at 8 minutes past 5. At about the same time, an unseen hand in a faraway engine house turned a crank and threw a giant lever, and huge drums began to roll, and so began the clanking grind of steel, steel rope, and ever-turning steel wheels that was then, and is now, one of San Francisco's most haunting and evocative sounds. The cable car lines were running, and one by one their carriages rumbled out of their barns, ready to haul passengers up and over the city's innumerable hills. And also one by one people, men by and large, began to appear in the still half-dark streets. These were either early starters idling their sleepy way to their offices or shops, or night shift workers heading wearily back home. The smell of baking bread mingled with coffee was in the air, as was the smoke of early cooking fires. The blue-uniformed policemen, slow and imperturbable, patrolled their allotted beats. The breeze was westerly, but light. Dawn was unfolding quietly, serenely. All was perfect peace. Well, that peace was savagely, profoundly interrupted at 12 minutes past 5, when an enormous rupture deep in the earth, some miles below the Pacific Ocean, just off southern San Francisco, occurred, sending shock waves cannonading at thousands of miles an hour to the north and to the south, and bringing down a great rain of destruction. The first person that we know experienced the earthquake was a labourer called Clarence Judson, and he was swimming, as was his wont, in the Pacific Ocean, off Ocean Beach, which is on the western side of the little sort of thumb-shaped peninsula that is San Francisco. And he went down to the sea at about 5 o'clock. And although memory plays tricks on people after catastrophes, he said that he thought that it was unusual that the normal Pacific rollers, which come in a fairly regular fashion, weren't operating that morning. The sea seemed unusually choppy. Everything was very confused and wild. But he went in nonetheless, and he was swimming quite contentedly when suddenly an enormous wave came out of nowhere and knocked him down, and he struggled to regain his balance, but he found that he couldn't reach the sand that he was walking on under his feet because it had disappeared, basically. And although he was an excellent swimmer, he was really quite frightened and started swimming frantically for shore, feeling with his feet for the sand. And occasionally it was there, and then it wasn't, and it seemed to be undulating in a peculiar and violent fashion. And when he got in really shallow water, he managed to get to his knees. He tried to stand up, but he couldn't. And then he managed to get out of the water, and as he did so, tried to stand up, he noticed his body was covered with phosphorescence, and when he shook the water off his fingers, it was glowing with a phosphorescence he had never seen before. And he struggled across the sand to where his towel and his dressing gown and his slippers were, but he once again kept getting knocked down, and it was a terrifying moment for him. And finally, he got to his towel and lay there and stayed still until whatever was happening stopped happening and everything returned to a kind of peace and equanimity. Well, much the same kind of bewildering, discombobulating turn of events happened all over the city. At the other end, for instance, on the other side of that thumb-shaped peninsula, on the Embarcadero side, the side of the bay, there was a policeman, I think, Officer Plume, I think his name was, and he was patrolling perfectly normally, checking on the locks of warehouses and things like that, when suddenly he heard this enormous roaring, a deep-throated roaring from the west, from where Clarence Judson was swimming. And he looked up, and of course it was becoming light, and he could see all the way up Washington Street, which is one of the very few streets that goes almost the entire way from the Embarcadero to the Pacific, and he climbs the hills and goes up and over Pacific Heights, Nob Hill, and all the rest of Russian Hill. And what he saw was that, as he described it, the whole street seemed to become like the sea itself, like a great wave, bucking and going up and down, like, if he had known the word, an enormous tsunami of cement and concrete. And the skyscrapers on top of the building were swinging towards him and then back again and then swimming towards him. And once they had done this for a few seconds, pieces started dropping off them. The columns and the cupolas fell off them, and all the Doric and Corinthian decorations started tumbling to the ground, and then the buildings themselves started breaking apart, and windows started falling out. And then the cobblestones of Washington Street suddenly were ripped open, like with a great zip fastener, and a huge chasm appeared in the street. And all the utility poles, which were shaking back and forward, suddenly started snapping like matchsticks. And the electrical cables, because San Francisco was festooned with electricity all of a sudden, started breaking, and the cables started falling to the ground and started writhing, as the officer put it, like serpents. And every time they touched each other, there was a great cannonade of sparks which went up in the air. Well, at the same time as these chasms were opening up in the streets, the gas pipes that supplied the gas to the street lamps, they fractured, and you get great sort of plumes of gas coming out of the street, which instantly ignited, either because of the sparks from these cables, or from the cooking fires which were being thrown out from under the chimneys that were falling all over the cities, because the chimneys are made of brick, and brick is very unstable. So you had coals, you had sparks, you had gas, and you had dozens of fires breaking out simultaneously all over the place. And they coalesced into much bigger fires and into considerably bigger fires, which in turn became firestorms, which sucked in their own oxygen and started growing on their own and sweeping under the influence of the westerly wind across the city. Well, and at the same time as all that happened, when these great cracks were opening in the streets, so the water mains broke. And you got huge volcanoes of water, which were very spectacular to look at, but ominously, after a few seconds, they died away, because all the water in the system drained away and the water mains fell dry. And that meant, it wasn't realized at first, that the fire department had no water with which to fight these enormous fires. And that was the secondary and great disaster which marked San Francisco. The additional tragedy was what happened to Dennis Sullivan. He, if you remember, crawled into bed with his wife on the 3rd floor of the Bush Street fire station. Next door was the California Hotel, which was one of these grandiose buildings topped with marble. It collapsed, and all the marble fell down onto this little brick-built fire station, driving Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan through the 3rd floor to the 2nd floor to the 1st floor, and then into the basement. Sullivan was cradling his wife in his arms, but when they got through to the basement, they snapped a steam pipe on a radiator and he was scalded to death with steam. So many people have said that had he survived, the fire department might possibly have rallied themselves sufficiently to put out the fires, but that would have been impossible, because leaderless or not, the fire department was waterless, and there was essentially nothing they could do to fight these fires. And interestingly, it's not a red herring, but I'm slightly jumping ahead of myself. For many years, there was an attempt to say that the disaster that had caused all the catastrophe, the destruction in San Francisco, was not caused by the earthquake, but was caused by the fire. This sort of canard was put about by the Southern Pacific Railway, principally, which didn't want investors to be frightened off coming to San Francisco if they thought it was likely to be hit by an earthquake again. But a fire is something which is in man's power to control. And so they deliberately said, they called it the San Francisco Fire of 1906, not the San Francisco Earthquake and Fire. And geologists universally were furious at this and said, and I think the message now has got through to everybody, that the ultimate cause of the catastrophe was these 2 minutes of ground shaking occasioned by the earthquake itself. Well, one of the nice things for me writing about this is, because San Francisco is a relatively young city, people that have lived there for many generations have kept every piece of paper, every photograph, and this was a very widely photographed disaster because Kodak had just invented the camera and it was a very cheap instrument, so there are lots and lots of snapshots of it. And there are also moving pictures because the Edison Cinematograph Company had a lot of cameras, and so people were just tremendously kind to me and gave diaries and watercolors and photographs and all manners of documents which I could peruse. And when I came to write the chapter on the earthquake itself, the savage interruption, as I called it in the book, I just had an embarrassment of riches in terms of choices of eyewitness accounts to choose from. I'm just going to read you the second piece, just to illustrate some of the slightly bizarre consequences of the earthquake. This actually doesn't come from a private communication. This is in the public record. It comes from a policeman, another chap an Irishman called Harry Walsh. What he saw next was memorably awful. A stampede of wild, long-horned cattle tearing towards him along Mission Street from the direction of the docks. It turned out later that a group of Mexican vaqueros had unloaded these beef cattle from an inbound ship and were droving them to the city stockyards in the south of town. The moment the shocks began, the drovers took off, leaving their herd to fend for itself. And as Officer Walsh put it, the cattle promptly went daft with terror and started running anywhere. And he continued, while a lot of them were running along the sidewalks of Mission Street between Fremont and First Streets, a big warehouse toppled onto the thoroughfare and crushed most of them clean through the pavement into the basement, killing them and burying them outright. The first that I saw of the bunch were caught and crippled by falling cornices or the like, and they were in great misery. So I took out my gun and shot them. Then I only had 6 shots left, and I saw that more cattle were coming along and that there was going to be big trouble. At that moment, I ran into John Moller, who owned the saloon. I asked him if he had any ammunition in his place, and if so, to let me have some, quick. He was very scared and excited over the earthquake and everything, and when he saw the cattle coming along, charging and bellowing, he seemed to lose more nerve. Anyway, there was no time to think. 2 of the steers were charging right at us while I was asking him to help, and he started to run for his saloon. I had to be quick about my part of the job, because with only a revolver as a weapon, I had to wait until the animal was quite close before I dared fire. Otherwise, I wouldn't have killed or even have stopped him. As I shot down one of them, I saw the other charging after John Moller, who was then at the door of his saloon and apparently quite safe. But as I was looking at him and the steer, Moller turned and seemed to become paralyzed with fear. He held out both hands as if beseeching the beast to go back, but it charged on and ripped him before I could get close enough to fire, and when I killed the animal, it was just too late to save the man. Then a young fellow came running up carrying a rifle and a lot of cartridges. It was an old Springfield, and he knew how to use it. He was a cool shot, and he understood cattle too. He told me later he came from Texas. We probably killed 50 or 60. We used the rifle alternately, the Texan and myself. Well, rather than dwelling any more about the mechanics of the event, I want to talk a bit more about the aftermath and the reaction. And the interesting aspect of the reaction I'll leave for a moment or two, because I think the events of Katrina rather compel me to try and compare what happened in the summer of 2005 with what happened in the spring of 1906. And quite candidly, what happened this year does not compare, because the reaction in 1906 was well nigh impeccable on all kinds of levels. And you've got to remember, of course, that although there had been 2 earthquakes before 1906 in San Francisco, there was very little folk memory. People didn't anticipate what was going to happen. This came out of a clear blue sky, quite literally, whereas what happened in Katrina we all knew about. We had Weather Channel, CNN, we could track it almost to within 5 miles. We knew exactly what was going to happen. But despite that, and despite the fact that they knew nothing of what was going to happen at 5:12 a.m. on that Wednesday morning, the reaction, by comparison, was astonishing. The military commander of San Francisco in 1906 was a very remarkable and interesting man. He was called Adolphus Washington Greeley. He was born up the road in Newburyport here. And a long time ago, I was very keen to write a book about him. He was an extraordinary fellow involved in an amazing disastrous expedition to the Arctic, cannibalism charges. He was one of the founders of the National Geographic magazine. I mean, I could go on and on, but I won't, because actually he's completely irrelevant to this story, because at the time of the earthquake, he was actually at his daughter's wedding in Chicago. So he missed the whole thing. His deputy, however, was a frightful, frightful man. He was called Frederick Funston, and he had been a commander in the Philippines and had done all manner of dreadful things. I mean, he had a take-no-prisoners policy. There were all kinds of allegations of torture. He was brought back to America, essentially in disgrace, came to Washington, D.C. Briefly, it was thought that he might pursue a political career, which I suppose follows somewhat naturally after behaving so badly. But he said, then made some appalling speech, very, very racist, and they said, no, even politics you can't go in for. So we'll simply demote you and send you to be the number 2 in San Francisco. And there he would have remained in obscurity. But he's a classic example, as are other players in this field, of that old adage about there comes a tide in the affairs of men which, taken on the flood, leads on to greatness, because he really rose to the occasion. He, like everybody else, was tumbled out of bed at 12 minutes past 5, instantly realized that he had soldiers under his command and he could deploy them. So he wrote a note, penciled note, to his adjutant down at the Presidio where the soldiers are based, found some fellow on a horse, gave him the note, told him to ride like fury down to the Presidio, And his adjutant obeyed his orders, which were simply to provide all available soldiers in full battle gear and make them march into San Francisco and offer themselves at the disposal of the mayor. But a completely illegal thing to do. I mean, you can't casually give federal troops into the custody of a city mayor, but Funston didn't care about the legal niceties, ordered it up, and 153 minutes after the earthquake, 2 hours and 33 minutes, you had 2 companies of federal troops with bayonets fixed, with ammunition in their pouches, all wearing full battle gear, marching through the fires and through the ruined buildings, a tremendous show of confidence to a bewildered and frightened citizenry. And sure enough, they presented themselves at the Hall of Justice to the mayor of San Francisco, who was an equally unprepossessing character. I mean, a terribly, terribly corrupt man. The city was a sink of corruption. And Eugene Schmitz, his name was, he was a violinist in a city jazz band. He was the president of the San Francisco Musicians Union. Not the sort of chap that you would think would rise to the occasion, but he did. He saw the soldiers and instantly realized law and order is breaking down over the city. I'm going to promulgate an order, and once again, I don't care about the legal niceties, saying that these troops, if they see anyone looting, will shoot them and will kill them. And this notice was hastily printed and posted up all over downtown San Francisco. Looting stopped in a heartbeat. It just all ended. He also said, the fires are uncontrollable. We have no water. The little knowledge I have of fires suggests that we need to create fire breaks. Soldiers have lots of dynamite and things that explode, so let's get from them as much dynamite as possible and get it quickly and start blowing up buildings. So that started happening. And also he said we need to commandeer a boat to the telegraph office in Oakland on the other side of the bay, which I suspect will be working. All the telegraphs in San Francisco City were out of commission, and send a message to say that San Francisco has been hurt, there are lots of people dead or dying, and we need help. And that message went out at about 11 o'clock, about 6 hours after the earthquake. And when it was received in Washington, President Teddy Roosevelt was in the White House, William Taft was his Secretary of War, they reacted with astonishing rapidity and efficiency. Congress was cajoled into meeting at 4 o'clock the following morning. All the necessary funds the enabling acts were passed. The Secretary of War ordered up over 500,000 rations to be sent down by wagon train from the Dakota Territories, which was the nearest place there were large caches of food. 5 relief trains, one of them the longest hospital train ever assembled in America, were ordered and started pounding their way west towards the Rocky Mountains from various bases. Later that day, the first relief train, which came from Southern California on Washington's orders, actually arrived in San Francisco at midnight on the very night of the earthquake. Within a week, every single tent in the possession of the American army in the continental United States was pitched in San Francisco, providing temporary housing for the 250,000 people that were rendered homeless. Within 2 weeks, 1 in 10 of the entire American Standing Army was on duty in San Francisco, clearing up and restoring order and generally helping. It was an astonishingly rapid and efficient exercise of federal power. And I suppose historically the kudos tends to go to the great organs of state that responded to this event, but I like the stories of the lesser, the unsung bureaucrats who we tend to forget, who also behaved with tremendous compassion. The story I like most of all is of the San Francisco Postmaster, who was a completely forgotten chap called Arthur Fisk. He realized that the victims of this earthquake needed more than anything else to tell their loved ones of their condition. But many of them either couldn't afford to buy postage stamps or simply couldn't find them in this appallingly wrecked city. And so he promulgated an order on his own recognizance, once again without looking over his shoulder to see if Washington approved, which said simply, any card or letter mailed into the San Francisco postal system, which clearly comes from the hand of a victim, but which does not bear a stamp shall not go undelivered for want of fee. Just seemed a wonderfully kind action. And all of those acts, all of them as it happens illegal, were decisively taken without anyone worrying about the legal consequences or any of the knock-on effects. So different from what happened this year, when, of course, we had a chap, whose primary interest was the care and maintenance of Arabian horses or whatever, which rendered him utterly incapable to manage that crisis. Anyway, I don't want to make too much of that comparison, but I think it's a valid one to make, particularly because of what I shall say at the very, very end of this. But the reason that San Francisco, in my view, was such an important catastrophe also was due to the reaction, but it was more to do with how humankind looks at catastrophes, natural disasters like this, and how everything changed in San Francisco. 1906 was a hinge point, a turning point, a tipping point. For instance, 1755, great earthquake utterly destroyed the city of Lisbon. Everyone, with the single exception of Voltaire, if you read Candide, with the single exception of Voltaire, everyone believed that what destroyed Lisbon was the work of a wrathful and angry God. And so what occurred, essentially, was what always occurs. You placate the deity, and in the case of Lisbon, the city authorities rounded up all available heretics and burned them. And it has to be said that there hasn't been an earthquake in Lisbon since. I've always been strongly in favour of burning heretics. Much the same thing happened 130 years later, Krakatoa, which was the subject of the last book I did. A different deity, but much the same view. The overwhelming reaction after Krakatoa among the Islamic community of West Java and Eastern Sumatra was that this was the work of an angry Allah, and he needed to be placated so that this didn't happen again. And the thing to do was to round up or to attack Dutchmen, because they were white, they were Christian, they were infidels, they were imperialists, they shouldn't be there. And so there were attacks, and the local mullah organized a sustained series of attacks using Krakatoa as the banner under which they were fighting, and essentially that was the beginning of the end for Dutch rule in this part of the world, because the attacks went on and on and on, and by the 1950s the Dutch had read the writing on the wall and left, and in what they left behind was the world's now most populous Islamic country, the Republic of Indonesia. So often the long shadow of these natural catastrophes can spread into completely unexpected and unrelated corners of society. Krakatoa had an effect, undeniably, on the creation of contemporary Indonesia. And oddly enough, although things did change in San Francisco, there was, particularly if you're mischievous and English and can be a little less reverent about this kind of thing, the long shadow of San Francisco hangs over us still, because there was a very important religious reaction after the earthquake. Essentially what happened was this. In the early part of the 20th century, in Kansas and West Texas, a charismatic Christian church got itself organized. The basis of this new religion was that God manifested himself by the peculiar, eccentric, dramatic behavior of members of the congregation. Some of them would fall to the ground, lose control of their muscles, they flail around, foam at the mouth, holy rollers, that's what they were called. Or they would suddenly start speaking in tongues. They would either speak complete gibberish, which is called glossolalia, or they would speak quite fluently and recognizably a language that they hitherto had no knowledge of, and that's called Xena Laelia. And so when you had in churches in places like Topeka and Amarillo and Laredo, people suddenly speaking fluent Bulgarian and Chinese, this was taken by these very enthusiastic pastors as a sign that God clearly was working his mysterious ways in these peculiar churches. Now, these churches essentially didn't spread initially to the somewhat skeptical east of America, but they did spread westward and like wildfire. In 1904, 1905, you get a lot of these charismatic churches opening up in southern Utah, southern Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and then in 1906, coincidentally, in California, and specifically, and as one might expect, in Southern California. And the first of these churches was opened in a disused stable in what was then the tiny cow town of Los Angeles. It only had a population of 40,000, in a street that, to historians of this particular movement, the charismatic Christian movement in this country, is very famous. It's called Azusa Street. And the Azusa Street revival is something that scholars in this particular field are very familiar with. The pastor stood up on Sunday, the 15th of April, 1906, and to a congregation of maybe 100 people, made a sermon in which he talked about the manifestations of the Lord, and people started, to fall about and flail and speak Romanian and things. And so this was taken as a sign that everything was working as normal. But, he said, there will be a major sign from God soon, he said. And this remark would have passed unnoticed, except for the fact that there was a reporter there from the Los Angeles Times. And the headline in this little newspaper, as it was then, on the Monday, the 16th of April, said, "Pastor warns of major sign from God." And, most people took this with a pinch of salt and thought nothing of it. Except 2 days later, the most sinful city in all of America was destroyed by a minute and a half of violent ground shaking and a fire. The following Sunday, 10,000 people turned up at that church. There was a riot on Azusa Street. It had to be broken up by the Los Angeles police. The church itself nearly collapsed under the weight of people trying to get onto the veranda, all essentially to hear the pastor, with a somewhat smug expression on his face, saying to the congregation, "I told you so." And with that, essentially, this is really oversimplifying charismatic history, but essentially, with the Azusa Street revival, was born in the United States the Pentecostalist movement. And the Pentecostal movement has formed the bedrock of the present day ultra-conservative fundamentalist Christian movement here, giving us such, intellectual giants and luminaries as Pat Robertson and Tammy Faye Baker and Jimmy Swaggart and all the rest of them. And if you're foreign and mischievous, you can say that members of these churches were winkled out of their church basements by Karl Rove 18 months ago to give us the second coming of, the second administration, I should say, of Mr. Bush. So the long shadow of San Francisco is with us today in an administration which we so enjoy in this country. However, and it is a very important however, the religious reaction to San Francisco was not, and for the first time in world history, was not the major reaction. The major reaction after the events of 1906 was a rational reaction. For the first time, people said, it is absurd to think that this is the work of God. This is the work of something occurring deep down under the surface of the earth, and we need to find out what happened. So rather than unleashing our clergy onto it, we need to unleash our scientists. And so for the first time, science began to look seriously at what really makes earthquakes and volcanoes occur. And in the specific case of San Francisco, the California Earthquake Commission was set up under the leadership of a man called Andrew Lawson, and he began with a considerable amount of state resources at his disposal to see exactly what had happened. And he found out one very interesting thing. he looked at the places in and around San Francisco where there had been a great deal of displacement of the earth. Many of you will know that in a little town called Olema, north of San Francisco, a farmer's fence was broken and shifted 21 feet because the earth moved 21 feet in certain places, 13 feet in another, 10 feet in another, and so on. He mapped where the greatest extremes of ground movement had occurred. And what he found initially was that there were very significant ground movements in a valley to the south of San Francisco, a valley that had a reservoir called the Crystal Springs Reservoir in it, and which was uncannily straight. The valley had been discovered by a Spanish explorer in 1757 and named on the day of its discovery, which was the 30th of November, after the saint whose feast day occurs then. It was the feast of St. Andrew, and this explorer called this the Valle de San Andreas. And Andrew Lawson found that along this San Andreas Valley, and then in a straight line going northwards under the city of San Francisco, and then northwards to Bolinas and Bodega Bay and east of Point Reyes, and all the way up the coast to Fort Bragg and to Mendocino, the greatest displacements were in a straight line. And in honor of the valley where he first discovered this, he declared that this line was a fault, and he would call it the San Andreas Fault. And the San Andreas Fault, 750 miles long, as we now know, stretching from up near Cape Mendocino in the north down to the Salton Sea in the south, well to the east of Los Angeles, is the Mischiefmaker. It is the principal engine work that causes all the seismic mayhem that involves the people of California. The discovery of that and the setting up that year in 1906 of the Seismological Society of America suddenly concentrated scientific minds on what are these faults, what is going on down there. And this led eventually, this intense study, to the adducing in 1965, relatively recently, by a hitherto unknown and still unsung, and a man who I think deserves a biography, a Canadian professor called J. Tuzo Wilson, came up with this theory that answered all the questions, the theory that everyone here is totally familiar with, the theory of plate tectonics. Now, you'll be mightily relieved. I'm not going to give or try and give a lecture on plate tectonic, but I want to just try and explain in summary what was discovered, because it relates to what's going on in California today. The planet is molten in the middle, rather like a pot of oatmeal on a stove, only in a spherical sense rather than simply a cylinder on a stove. There are convection currents welling up and going back into as they cool down. These currents, on top of them sits this very thin crust of the Earth. The crust we now know is made up of between 20 and 30 enormous plates of material, which, under the influence of the motion of these plates, move about and jostle one against the other. And they essentially do four things. They either collide with each other head on. That's what's happening at the moment in Kashmir. It's why we've got earthquakes in Kashmir, because the India plate, which is moving steadily northwards across the Indian Ocean and has been doing for the last 200 million years at 46 millimeters every single year, moving slowly, it's been colliding for the last 50 million years with the Eurasia plate. And rather like two freight trains hitting each other in a collision on a single line, when they do so, everything rears up in the middle. What that does when two plates are colliding is it causes mountain chains. And in the specific case of Kashmir, it causes the Himalayas and the Karakoram and the Pamirs and the Hindu Kush. And in the making of these mountains, it causes earthquakes. There are frequent, inevitable earthquakes on this dangerous plate boundary. So what happened a month ago was not, by geologists, at all unexpected. It's an inevitable consequence of the collision of two plates. Now, if two plates are of very different weights, rather like an SUV hitting a Mini in a freeway crash, one will dive underneath the other. That is another type of collision. And you get phenomena that's happening off the coast of Washington and Oregon, and it's happening off the coast of Sumatra and Java. And what happens there, when one plate dives below another, in what's called a subduction zone, you get volcanoes. Then what happens when two plates are pulling apart from one another? Then you get a sort of rather benign exudation of core material out into the surface of the Earth. You get hydrothermal springs, you get hydrothermal power stations, you get Iceland, in short. Iceland is a place where plates are pulling apart. And then the fourth kind of thing that happens is that plates give each other a glancing blow. They slide, they scrape past each other. And that is what is happening on the San Andreas Fault. We live here on the North America Plate. The San Andreas Fault marks the boundary between the western edge of the North America Plate and the Pacific Plate on which sits Japan and New Zealand and Hawaii. And that, rather like the India Plate, is moving northwards unstoppably at 1.5 inches every year. It cannot be stopped, except in the north of California, just in the north of California, it is pressing so tightly against the North America Plate. It's rather like a rusty brake drum on an old car. It's trying to move at 1.5 inches every year, but it can't overcome this rust until the tension and the stress becomes so great that eventually it overcomes it and it moves. And when it moves like that, this rupture suddenly causes earthquakes. That is why the San Andreas Fault, just like the boundary in Kashmir, represents a plate boundary and a tremendously dangerous place to live, to build cities, a very ill-advised place for humankind to settle. The holy grail of all seismological research in the past 100 years has been to try and predict earthquakes. And science has come a long way. We can predict hurricanes. I mean, we knew exactly where Katrina, Rita, Wilma were going to hit and when they were going to hit. To a very large extent these days, we can predict volcanoes. You'll remember Dixie Lee Ray evacuated most of the area around Mount St. Helens in 1980, and when it eventually erupted on May the 18th, 1980, a relatively small number of people died. Can they then predict earthquakes? And the short answer is, regrettably, no, they can't. Except there's a field which is giving some small grounds for optimism within the geological community. No one is saying they're going to be able to predict, but there are indications that the world is linked in a way that we never quite thought it was. And a new field of what's called trigger seismicity is beginning to interest people, and it's relevant to what is happening today. It seems that certain years are very unusually seismically active. We're living in such a period now. It began on the 26th of December 2003. Many of you will remember there was a devastating earthquake that day in western Iran, which destroyed a little brick-built town of great historical significance called Bam. 1 year later, almost to the hour, 57 minutes short of an hour, the 26th of December 2004, there was this tremendous submarine earthquake off Banda Aceh, which caused the tsunami, which is probably the greatest natural catastrophe that any of us in this room will know about in our lifetimes. 285,000 people are now known to have died in that. So between these two bookends of calamity, if you can put it like that, were an immense number of other seismic events. There were big earthquakes in New Zealand, in China, in Japan, in South America. Mount St. Helens was acting up during 2004, and there was a 6.0 in California. And it's still going on today. I mean, one can say that what happens in Kashmir at the moment is an extension of this very, very active period. Well, much the same, oddly enough, happened in 1906, and only in 1906. 1906 we tend to think of, if we think of it at all, as the year of the San Francisco earthquake. But Christmas 1905, there was a huge earthquake in Kashmir. 20th of January 1906, a very big earthquake on the Colombian-Ecuadorian border. That was followed by a big earthquake in St. Lucia. There was an earthquake in a place called Shamarka in the Caucasus. Then 8,000 people died in March when an earthquake struck Formosa, as it was then, Taiwan today. Then Vesuvius started erupting killing hundreds, didn't stop erupting until that Tuesday, the 17th of April. The next day, San Francisco ruptured with all that death and destruction, and as if that wasn't enough, 2 months later, 21,000 people were killed when the city of Valparaiso in Chile was flattened by an earthquake. So it's beginning to seem now to geologists as if one enormous event, set off by who knows what, can trigger a wave of sympathetic earthquakes around the world in the period, the year or so afterwards. It's as if the first earthquake sets the whole planet ringing like it was an enormous brass bell hit by a clapper, and it just vibrates. And anyone unlucky enough to live on one of the plate boundaries is at great risk during that subsequent year or so. It's of no comfort to anyone, but it is indicating to geologists that the connectivity of the world may lead us to some possibility of prediction in the future. And interestingly, and I'll just finish with this one point before I just summarize, there's been some new research which further underlines this notion of the interconnectedness of the world relating to Yellowstone National Park. You'll be familiar with all the geysers there, which, like Old Faithful, erupt very faithfully on cue every 52 or 55 minutes or whatever it is. Well, they've noticed recently that whenever there's an earthquake on the Denali Fault in eastern Alaska, 2,000 miles away, most of the geysers in Yellowstone suddenly start speeding up and start erupting every 45 minutes instead of every 55 minutes, and do this for a week and then slow down again. So that also indicates that over 2,000 miles there's some curious and unanticipated connectivity. Now I just want to finish this and leave you with two thoughts. And the first thing I want to say, I don't want it to sound in any way condescending, but in mature countries, and by that I mean old countries, very old countries of Europe and Asia, our big cities that exist today are essentially where they were meant to be. I mean, London, Paris, Berlin, Moscow, Peking, thousands of years old. And they're there because they're in seismically relatively stable places and they're not afflicted by destructive extremes of weather. But by the same token, these mature countries are littered with the ruins of cities that were built where they should not have been built. Places like Pompeii and Herculaneum and Petra and Heliopolis and Ayutthaya in Thailand. And we go to look at them as tourists, and we gawp at these ruins and are amazed at the skill of the civilizations that built them, and we may perhaps wonder why they're no longer inhabited. But we sort of take these ruins for granted. They're part of the fabric of our civilization. America, however, is a country entirely without ruins. There are a few ghost towns, sure, where there have been played out silver mines and gold mines, but there are no ruined cities, because this country is young enough to have placed its cities down where it jolly well pleases, and hasn't had to suffer the consequences yet of having placed them in places where they shouldn't have been built. But I wonder, in 200 years' time or so, if you were to look at a map of the United States, maybe there will be ruins that people go to as tourists. One has to suggest, heresy though it may be, that New Orleans may well be one of them, because when you come to think of it, building a city in a swamp 20 feet below sea level between a lake and a river in a part of the world that's afflicted by constant tropical storms and hurricanes is a bit short-sighted. By the same token, Phoenix, Tucson, even Las Vegas. I mean, there is no water there, and there is no great history in the world of putting big cities in the middle of deserts. So I wonder whether they too may, in a couple of hundred years, be ruins. I somehow can't see tourists of 2300 being terribly eager to traipse around the ruins of Phoenix and look at the Walmart that was, or whatever. And then that brings us, of course, to San Francisco and the cities of the Bay. There is no getting away from the fact that the Bay Area is one of the most dangerous seismically active plate boundaries in the world. It is unimaginable, I think, that one ever posit the notion of tourists coming to look at the stumps of the Golden Gate Bridge or the shell of the Transamerica building. But I think for that to happen, America, or California specifically, has to follow the lead from the one country in the world that has, for the last 2,000 years, learned to accommodate to seismic extremes, and that is Japan. I mean, Japan is those 4 islands are very, very dangerously sited. And yet, by dint of building sensibly in the early days with wood and paper, and nowadays with very high-tech building techniques, but also by dint of relentless training of people, by having in every prefecture, every town, every village stocks of emergency supplies, and having people on the ground who know what to do, and have people turning out at the siren's call every couple of weeks to train and to drill for what will happen when an earthquake will occur. That keeps Japan's casualties to a minimum. I mean, Kobe was bad, but they learned a lot from it. The Tokyo earthquake that will inevitably happen. I mean, the 1923 one was dreadful. The next one will also be dreadful, but it'll be survivable. Judging from Katrina, the catastrophe that is creeping up inevitably, either on the Hayward Fault, where there's a now 62% chance of a 6.5 magnitude earthquake or above between now and 2030, that'll afflict Oakland and Richmond and Berkeley, or the big one itself on the San Andreas Fault. How will San Francisco manage? Are the emergency preparedness people political cronies, big donors, Arabian horse trainers or whatever? Or are they firefighters and soldiers and the kind of people that can respond effectively? They are in Japan. I wonder whether they are in America. I feel, regrettably, that in California a sense of denial pervades society. It's just so easy to open another bottle of Sauvignon Blanc and forget all about it. Having said that, I just want to leave one final brief short thought and then I'll be quiet. I was talking, and it's about this sense of denial, I was talking recently to an audience in, I think it was Kansas City, about the supervolcano that will inevitably occur under Yellowstone, what we were just talking about. As I'm sure you all know, there is an enormous magma body, very shallow, beneath the Yellowstone National Park. And the USGS recently has measured the elevation of the bottom of Yellowstone Lake and the Yellowstone River, and has shown that they're rising and falling with a peculiar sort of regularity. And if you're of a romantic temperament, you can imagine this great thing, hot body of molten magma underneath Yellowstone, breathing in and out and readying itself to do its mischief. Well, one day, there is absolutely no doubt at all, one day there will be an eruption at Yellowstone, and it will be a titanic eruption. It is said that when Yellowstone eventually blows, the entire northwest of the United States will be devastated. There won't be a city left. The entire place will be covered with lava. It'll be finished. It'll be toast, as they put it. And the audience was, somewhat alarmed, but I said, don't worry, because this is only talked about in geological terms. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It almost certainly won't happen for about, to judge on the geological record, 250,000 years. And by that time, of course, the entire human species will be extinct. And everyone was terribly relieved by this, except for one woman sitting in the front row, who very angrily, seriously angrily, waved her hand at me, and she said, "What?" with total incredulity in her voice. "What?" she said. "Even Americans will be extinct?" With that, I'll stop it. If there are any questions, I'd be delighted. Thank you very much. I've just looked at my watch, and I've rather kept you over time. I'm awfully sorry. I just too
Thank
tense.
you very much, Simon Winchester. We do have a sense that he's graciously agreed to take some questions. We have a few minutes for that, after which Simon and the rest rest of us will adjourn to the ballroom. Simon is going to be signing some of his copies of his books from the San Francisco earthquake, which is not only a compelling account of that event, but it also comes with a very intriguing dust rabbit, too, which you just have to have.
You have to, yes.
Once again, Simon, thanks very much, and we'll look forward to the electronics.
Right, thank you, right. So anybody would... Ma'am, there.
Has anyone been studying the signals animals can give?
Has anyone been studying the signals that animals can give? Well, the short answer is very little, and much too little. There is a sort of pseudo-science called ethogeological prediction, in which a number of adherents believe that animals definitely send out signals. But the actual systematic study of it, the only one that I know of, was done by a chap from the California Geological Survey about 20 years ago, who collected all the lost pet advertisements he could possibly find from small ads all over America over a period of about 10 years, and annotated and collated them all, and claimed to find that whenever there was a spike in the number of lost dogs or lost cats, there was an earthquake shortly thereafter. So that's the only specific thing I've ever found. But the Chinese are doing some research onto the thought that snakes go rigid before an earthquake. But the stories you hear, it's rather like earthquake weather. There is no such thing as earthquake weather. So often when there is, there was an earthquake in Paso Robles about 2 years ago, and people said, oh yes, just before the quake it got suddenly very humid, and my horse began rolling its eyes, and the cats disappeared. Well, actually the weather before the earthquake in Paso Robles was entirely normal, right up to and after the moment that the earth broke. And all cats and dogs and horses seemed actually not to have behaved any more eccentrically. They were still rolling their eyes the next day because, a car went past or something. So I think it's a field that should be studied, but so far science is sufficiently skeptical that it hasn't. Ma'am. Oh, really?
We were in Olympia when St. Thomas went out. We were in Whittier when the Whittier earthquake happened. And we were in San Jose when the Valparaiso went out. Now,
would you mind leaving? Yes, I just don't want to be this awful Cassandra. You're right. There are many things that were around the world that would go off. There are huge volcanoes waiting to pop in Sumatra, which would... Well, no, Rainier, yes. But I think geologists are confident. The knowledge of volcanoes' behavior is such that most people accept that Rainier is not going to pop for some long time. It's not misbehaving. It's not bulging to the northeast like Mount St. Helens was in 1980, and they monitor it all the time. But, it'll be a brave geologist who actually says to the people of Seattle, I think you ought to evacuate the entire city, and then what, nothing happens, or it doesn't happen for a month or something? Indeed. Well, in theory, everyone living on a plate boundary should evacuate and live in Nebraska, and then die of boredom. Now, I'm told by my masters that I've been waffling on for so long, so I'm going to stop and go out to the back. Thank you all very much indeed.